Hello everybody, my name is Professor Keith McLay and I'm really sorry that I can't be joining you today at the conference. I really would have liked to be able to do that. But this is my contribution to the conference at Prestonpans, and the title of my paper is Decision at Derby, a Study in Generalship. And what I want to do over the course of the next 25 minutes or so is really just to try and examine the context behind the decision taken at Derby in Exeter House, the image at the bottom of the presentation there in Derby on the 5th of December, for the Jacobite forces, the movement led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, the image in the middle of the slide there, to retreat from Derby and not press on to London, and in effect retreat back up through the north of England and into Scotland. And the key principal protagonists in this decision were, of course, Bonnie Prince Charlie himself, Lord George Murray, the individual on the left of the slide, who was Lieutenant General of the Jacobite forces, and the Irish advisor, John O'Sullivan, who's on the right of the slide. And John O'Sullivan was the Adjutant General, the Quartermaster of the Jacobite forces since their march down from Scotland originally. Now, the decision at Derby on the 5th of December is typically framed as one in which the Jacobite forces and the Jacobite leadership were facing a series of military realities. And so it is therefore the military historiography which tends to dominate and frame the decision to rush headlong into retreat to Scotland, and thus ultimately to the Jacobites' defeat at Culloden in April of 1746. And in that military framing of the decision, it is typically argued that gaining the upper hand in the argument was ultimately Lord George Murray. And his upper hand was to say that it would be military folly to press on to London, to march the 5,000 odd Jacobite strong force down into London, facing as it did 3 columns of the British Army marching upwards from the north and downwards, marching upwards from the south and marching downwards from the north to convene on Derby and to try and prevent the Jacobites making that progress through to London. That was Lord George Murray's argument, it is stated. On the other hand, of course, it is argued that John O'Sullivan was all for pressing on and trying to capitalise on what he considered, and Bonnie Prince Charlie, in fairness, considered to have been the signal military success of the Jacobite forces up to that point. And what I want to do today is to try and question that framing of the decision at Derby in purely military terms, and to make the case that actually, as a study in generalship, the decision at Derby had many, many more facets and elements to it, of which the military realities were but only one. In order to arrive at my argument vis-a-vis the extra and additional elements to this decision at Derby, I thought it helpful just to characterise the 45 in the military pantheon of Jacobite rebellions, because this is quite important in one context for my argument, because what I am suggesting here is, as I'm sure the audience will be very familiar with, that the various Jacobite rebellions which had occurred since 1689 and the revolution of 1688, when when James VII fled the throne in London into exile in France on Christmas Day 1688, and that there arose a movement, the Jacobite movement, to try and restore James and his heirs to the thrones of Britain. These rebellions, which had taken place from 1689, the original one, which was associated with the revolution of 1688, had been both national and international in their complexion. So the first one in 1689 did have that national origins and inspiration in the revolution of 1688. By the time we arrive at 1708 with the second substantive Jacobite rebellion, it is characterised as one in which the Scottish card was being played in the wider anti-unionist movement which had sprung up following the Act of Union between Scotland and England of 1707. And the French, of course, were instrumental in supporting the playing of that Scottish card, with the Jacobites acting, if you like, as the outriders for anti-unionism. So there's both a national and international context there, which is significant. In 1715, in which some historians would suggest and argue that the Jacobites had their most propitious opportunity to actually be successful in their movement, it was all about opposing the Hanoverian succession, with the death of Queen Anne in 1714, succeeded by the Elector of Hanover, George I, as the king. And the Jacobites, again strongly supported by the French and the French context, thought that they could ensure an undermining of what was at that point in 1715 a fairly weakly posited Hanoverian monarchy. Of course, we know that that ultimately failed. Then, 4 years later, in 1719, there was yet another Jacobite rebellion, but it was that rebellion in which the French had stepped back very much in their support, and the Spanish were using the Jacobites as a means to apply diplomatic pressure in the European context. So that particular and disastrous rebellion had that very much international flavour attached to it. And then by the time that we get to 1745, the rebellion that was very much made in the name of Bonnie Prince Charlie, the context for the 45 rebellion was at one both national and international, drawing upon the history of the previous rebellions, which had had both a national and international complexion in varying degrees. Why is this important? Well, it's important because militarily, the 45 was exceptionally modest in its beginnings. And this is an important element when we are starting to rethink the decision at Derby in terms of a study in generalship. Because the argument that I'm going to start to make is that actually, militarily, the start of the rebellion, the march through Scotland, the march down through into England, told the Jacobites very little about their military capabilities in truth, and that, in a sense, they were entirely untested, so that when we come to Derby and the decision there, the military realities are actually only but one part, and they're but one part which is actually pretty occluded from the situation, because little is known about the military capabilities of the Jacobites by the time they reach Derby. We know that Bonnie Prince Charlie, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, landed in the Isle of Ericsay on the 23rd of July with but 7 companions, the 7 men of Moidart. And indeed, initially, the support from the clans was very, very modest. We can see that the MacDonalds of Clanranald, the Morar, and also the MacGregors and Glenbucket's Gordons did turn out, but not in significant number, size, or scale. Bonnie Prince Charlie made some good progress through to the head of Loch Shiel, where famously, as we all know, the Royal Jacobite standard was unfurled at Glenfinnan. And at that point, he received important, but again, still relatively modest support from the Camerons and MacDonald of Keepaugh. At that point, the prospects for this Jacobite rebellion militarily looked extremely dim and unlikely. The Jacobites did move, as we know, from Glenfinnan, out from Glenfinnan, past Fort William, along through the Great Glen to Fort Augustus. And it was at that point that they saw the opportunity to open up and move down into the lowlands of Scotland. But at that stage, it wasn't as a result of military acumen, it wasn't as a result of an astute ordering of his forces, and it wasn't as a result of winning any signal engagement. It was serendipitous, in my view, that the Jacobites were able to move swiftly down through the lowlands to Edinburgh. And it was serendipitous principally because the main government commander, General Sir John Cope, was an elderly, fairly ineffectual military leader. And when he arraigned his forces at the southern end of the Corryarrack Pass, where the lowlands opened up, if you got through the Corryarrack Pass, you could then open up and march down through the lowlands. And when he posted his forces at that southern end of the Corryarrack Pass, he received false intelligence that the Jacobites were taking another route, and therefore John Cope led his troops onto the road to Inverness, thereby opening up entirely the lowlands for the Jacobites. And Bonnie Prince Charlie and his forces had to do very little in order to move down through to Edinburgh. Again, it is often argued within the historiography that the entry into Edinburgh on the 17th of September, and then the seminal battle at Prestonpans, where the audience, of course, are today, was one in which it was a signal Jacobite military victory that demonstrated the prospects of their military success. But in fact, entering into Edinburgh on the 17th of September saw Cope also disembark his forces at Dunbar and lead them around 2,500 towards Edinburgh, where the Jacobites were, and he was anticipating this battle at Prestonpans. Now, Cope had in fact assumed a fairly strong defensive position, particularly on his right wing with marshland, and in the front it was also a fairly stout position that he had adopted. But yet again, the Jacobites benefited from a large degree of luck. They had a local supporter, a local man, Robert Anderson, who led the Jacobites through the Tranent Meadows Marsh to force the Hanoverians to wheel to the east and thus disorder their line, allowing the Jacobites to undertake a fairly quick charge, the fabled Highland Charge, which continued the disordering of Cope and his lines and allowed, within about famously 15 minutes, the Jacobites to rout the government forces, the Hanoverian forces. If they had not had that local knowledge to be led through the marshland, if Lord George Murray had not prevailed in terms of not permitting or persuading Bonnie Prince Charlie not to rush headlong into the Hanoverian front line, but to try and force them to wheel to the east, then the results of that battle would likely have been quite different. And so thus the argument is that the Jacobite generalship at Prestonpans was still largely untested. And it was untested as they moved to march throughout the south of England, or march through the south of Scotland into the north of England over the months of October to December 1745. We understand that when they moved out from Edinburgh at the beginning of November, following a very vigorous debate within the Jacobite councils as to whether this was the right thing to do, but the persuasion was that yes, they needed to start to move into the north of England to gain additional support, particularly from the northwest, which had the largest demographic of Roman Catholics, and that they thought that they would pick up a number of supporters there. Of course, that did not happen. The progress was very successful down the northwest coast, Penrith, Kendal, Lancaster, as is there on the slide. I'm sure colleagues in the audience don't need to, will know already the stunning success of the Jacobites' march southwards. But clearly, a critical point was that in all of this marching down through to Derby, militarily, the Jacobites again remained untested, as they had in the north of Scotland, as they moved through to the lowlands, as I would argue they did and were untested at Prestonpans. Again, they were untested in this march south. And that secondly, this campaign, this marching campaign, this military campaign down through to Derby was actually a politically Pyrrhic victory, because the support that they anticipated that they would get from this march never materialised. So while on the surface it seemed to be inordinately successful for the Jacobites, they seemed to have wind in their sails with the ease that they moved through the north of England through to Derby. Actually, in terms of gaining and securing additional support, whether that be in terms of military personnel or whether that be politically in terms of ideological support, it just never materialised in the way that they thought that it would. So that then leads us to the decision at Derby, or in fact, back to the decision at Derby. I said at the outset that I wanted to try and question this framing of the decision at Derby being one of military reality, that they had no choice militarily but to return to Scotland, and that decision, that military decision, had been informed by their stunning success up to this point. Rather, I would like to posit that the decision at Derby as a study in generalship needs to interpret generalship in this context as a concatenation of 4 different elements which informed and drove the decision to move into retreat. On the one hand, there was the national context in which the Jacobite movement was a broad church of Roman Catholicism, of non-juring Anglicans, and indeed of Episcopalians. And there was inherent tension in that national context of support for the Jacobites. Politically, there was support from both the Whigs and more so from the Tories, but that again was divided, it was fractious, it was not absolute. And then thirdly, in terms of the national context, and this is something I will return to in a minute, the objectives, the purpose of the Jacobite movement in the 45 rebellion was uncertain, it was unknown, and it was divided. Did the Jacobites want to just secure the old Scottish throne for the Stuarts, or did they have ambitions beyond that, which included the British thrones and of course securing an autonomous Catholic Ireland? The international context also framed the decision at Derby as one element of that concatenation. The Jacobites had been, as I mentioned right at the outset, variously supported by France, by Spain, by Rome over the course of the movement's existence through to 45. There had been various reasons, various points of connection for that support, being religious, being the reason of the state, the raison d'etat, or being an affinity with a monarchy which had been, it was viewed, unfairly pushed into exile and the hereditary succession disrupted and upended. The Jacobites had been variously used internationally as diplomatic currency by international powers, as pawns in the great power game, or they were viewed simply by some powers as an irrelevance and not to be engaged with because they could provide no substantive support to that country. In terms of the 45, that international context had led to initial French support and help in order to mount the 45, but the promised French support that was to come just never materialised. Thirdly, there were military realities, although I'm trying to mount an argument here which decouples the dominance of the military historiography in framing the decision at Derby. There were undoubtedly military realities which had to be taken into place. There was to be a convergence of 3 columns of the British Army onto the Jacobite forces in Derby from the north and from the south. The force of those columns were about double the size of the 5,000 strong Jacobites. So there was undoubtedly a case that if they were to press onwards to London, there was a military element to this decision. Did they have force of sufficient size and scale to continue the march successfully? And then fourthly, the movement itself was one that was divided and uncertain. And this is an element that has had some currency within the analysis of the decision at Derby, but my argument has had insufficient currency in that decision. And it really does frame the generalship, if we like to take Bonnie Prince Charlie's generalship as a whole, as one of political purpose. There were siren voices within the Jacobite movement, principally, yes, from the Protestant Scottish advisors, that actually going into the north of England and indeed moving further down south was folly, that it was not necessary. What the Jacobite movement was about was anti-unionism. It was about severing that link between Scotland and England, dependent upon the Act of Union of 1707, and indeed to go back even to before a circumstance of the Union of Crowns in 1603, whereby there was a sole and separate Scottish throne, divorced from any other aspect of what was at that time viewed as Great Britain. And the Scottish advisors, and Lord George Murray was prominent amongst them, purpose in the 45 was to secure that Scottish throne and to secure Scotland. For others in the Council of War at Derby, the political purpose for the Jacobites was quite different. It was about securing the British throne so that they had the whole of mainland Britain, but crucially, they made good on James VII II's promise in 1689 that Catholic Ireland would be autonomous. And the only way to secure that was to capture the Westminster throne, if you characterise it like that, the British throne, the combined thrones, if you like. The only way of securing Ireland's autonomy as a Catholic nation was to do that. Securing Scotland would be insufficient, it wouldn't be enough. And therefore, the purpose of the Jacobite movement was to press on to London in order to liberate not only mainland Britain, but also that of Catholic Ireland. So those two political purposes within the movement were fundamentally at odds and divided. And that meant that there was no way that the Jacobites had a coherent voice and purpose, which mapped onto the national context with the divisions amongst the composition of the Jacobite movement, mapped onto the international context, where there were divisions and uncertainties about the support being gained from the international powers for the Jacobite movement, mapped onto the military reality, whereby, although it was said that there was a latency to Jacobite support in London, to date, that had not been demonstrated, and that they were facing three columns of a well-organised British army under the overall command of the Duke of Cumberland, who had proven himself to date to be a military commander of some competence and repute, certainly much more so than Sir John Cope back in Prestonpans. So if we interpret, therefore, the decision at Derby as not one of military realities or not one informed by military aspects, but instead a concatenation of elements feeding into it. My final point is to suggest that although our favourite philosopher of war, Karl von Clausewitz, post-dates this Jacobite movement, to take and paraphrase Clausewitz's famous epigram about war as a continuation of politics or policy by other means, actually, the decision at Derby as a study in generalship exposed the clear limitations of that epigram, because the generalship being exercised at Derby in Exeter House was one in which politics and policy was hopelessly divided, hopelessly uncertain, with different voices adding into the decision on the generalship of that point in time. And therefore, pursuing war, pursuing rebellion as a means to achieve politics or policy had clear limitations for Bonnie Prince Charlie at Derby. So for Bonnie Prince Charlie, The decision at Derby was one in which it was informed by a large number of elements, a concatenation of elements and circumstances, not simply the military realities of the Jacobite force at that point in time. And moreover, it became all too clear to Bonnie Prince Charlie that rebellion and war at Derby had run up against the limitations of being a pursuit of politics or policy, or indeed the pursuit of the restoration of the Stuart House at that point in time. Thank you very much.